Now, we've been talking a lot about how energy efficiency is really important in modern cars. And one of the things we started to talk about when we were talking about energy, we were talking about how the automobile converts energy in the form of the gas we buy into motion. Now, do you remember what we said about how efficient a modern automobile actually is? How much of the gas you put in your car actually makes the car go? Does anyone remember? All right, that's okay. For those of you who may not remember, here's the problem. A modern car takes the energy we put in the gas tank, converts nearly 100% of that into heat energy, and only 27% of that energy actually becomes motion. That means that about 70% of the energy in that fuel turns into heat energy and goes nowhere. What do you suppose would happen if that heat energy continued to build up?
My car would catch on fire.
Your car would catch on fire. That's a good one. How about anyone else? What else do you think would happen if the heat continued to build up?
It wouldn't run. It wouldn't combust.
It wouldn't combust. It would run poorly anyway because it would overheat, wouldn't it?
Sure.
Absolutely. And, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what happens to that energy. If 70% of the energy we put in the gas tank, meaning $7 for every $10 you spend, is wasted energy, what happens to all of that energy? It's heat energy, right? So we need to get rid of it. The question is, how does a modern automobile get rid of all that extra heat? So we're going to talk about that today. And this is a really exciting topic for me because as modern automotive technicians, it's been said that 40 cents of every dollar that's spent on auto repair starts with the cooling system. 40 cents of every dollar. Now that doesn't mean that 40% of automotive repair is directly to the cooling system. What it means is that 40% of the problems that happen on cars start out as a direct or indirect result of cooling problems. So if you have a car that starts to overheat, that does tend to cause other problems. So let me just start out. We'll talk about how common is this problem really. Does anyone in here, have you ever personally or do you know somebody who's had a cooling system problem on their car? You ever had that kind of a problem? Two of you? All right. Tell me about it. What can you tell me?
Well, I used to have a Ford. It wasn't even that old, but there was a leak in the radiator system. And I would have to pull over every 5-10 miles and refill my radiator.
So it was just
fluid.
leaking out?
It was pretty much leaking out.
Excellent. Well, that's a good example because if you'd let it all leak out,
Car overheats and then you don't go anywhere.
it would have overheated. You would have done serious damage to the engine, possibly even needed another engine, right? That can become a pretty serious problem pretty quickly. Andy, you said you also had seen overheating problems. Is your own experience or someone you know?
My own experience.
Uh-huh.
I had a head or a valve or something went bad on me, and it caused the exhaust valve to open up into the water jacket,
Oh my gosh.
causing the water pump, the radiator, and pretty much everything that touched the water system to explode.
Wow. So it overpressurized the cooling system, and then it forced out the coolant.
Yeah.
When it forced out the coolant, you were back in the same situation that Amber could potentially have been in. No coolant, engine overheats quickly, and when the engine overheats, it does damage to itself. Good examples. The cooling system, when functioning properly, can prevent those things from happening. Obviously, in your case, if the cooling system retains its cool, doesn't have any leaks in it, then what happens is that coolant can help to get rid of the heat from the engine. Now let's talk just real quickly about the science behind heat transfer. We talked about where the heat comes from. Now how do we get rid of it? There are 3 methods for heat transfer in the cooling system. And these are the 3 methods. We have conduction, convection, and radiation. We're going to talk first about conduction. Now, we've probably heard the phrase conducting of heat or thermal conduction. Can you tell me an example from your own life of where you might have experienced something being conducted? Have you heard that phrase before? All right. When would you say that you've seen something that's been conducted?
When I stuck my finger in a light socket, I conducted electricity.
Yes, you conducted electricity from yes. But we're talking, and you know what? Energy conduction is very much the same principle, whether it's electrical energy or heat energy. In this case, we're talking about heat energy, which works much the same, actually. And we have an example of conduction and how conduction works. This is a three-person activity, and I actually have a job for every one of you. So I have a recorder job, somebody who's going to write down what's going on. She's got the recorder job. I have a reporter job, so someone who's going to report on what has been done at the end of the experiment. You're going to be my reporter, all right? And then I have an experimenter job, or if you prefer, a guinea pig job, and that is going to be your job. So here's what we're going to do. I have ice in a Ziploc bag, and I have ice in my hand. And I'm going to have you hold the Ziploc bag ice in one hand and close your fist around that. I might have you hold this in the other hand, the ice is by itself, and close your fist around that. And we're going to count down about 20 seconds. And while we're doing that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what a conductor does. Now, a conductor is something that carries energy. So wire is thought of as an electrical conductor, and the insulation on the outside of the wire is not a conductor. Now, in this case, we are doing an experiment in heat conducting. And that's about our 20 seconds, so we can stop now. Now, I would like for you, okay, so my recorder, what was it that you saw while we were doing this experiment? What were your observations immediately?
He was getting a little fidgety with the ice.
He was getting a little fidgety. Okay. Probably because his hands were getting cold, right? Yeah. And you were the guinea pig. Do you have any other observations about it?
My hand was cold and wet, and this one was cool and dry.
Cold and wet versus cold and dry. And you're the reporter here, so how would you summarize what we learned in this experiment?
Well, when the cold ice was directly on the skin, it seemed to make his hand more red and colder than when he had his hand in the bag and his hand was not red.
Excellent. So one hand turned red, and it looked as though it got colder. The other hand didn't turn red, and obviously one hand got wet, the other one didn't. Excellent observations. Thank you, Andy. Good work. This is what we're talking about. In the hand that had the Ziploc baggie, the bag itself was not a good conductor of heat. It didn't convey the heat from his hand to the ice, causing it to melt. In the other hand, he had ice, which quickly formed a layer of water, and that layer of water was a good conductor of heat. It carried heat from his hand to the ice cube. One of the hands was definitely getting cold faster for reasons having to do with one having a conductor, one having an insulator. One hand carried away heat energy from his body more quickly. Excellent observations. Good work. Now, what we're talking about is the conduction of energy, heat energy. The interesting thing here, when we think about ice, we think that ice cubes themselves are very cold, right? If you came up with a list of adjectives to describe ice, cold would certainly be on that list. The interesting thing is that in terms of what we're talking about, the science here, there's literally no such thing as cold. What we are talking about is a measurement of how much heat energy is present in a thing. So you could say something contains less heat, but you can't really compare that to saying it's cold. And the reason we talk this way when we're talking about the science behind it is because if you were comparing heat to cold, you're comparing two different things, aren't you? But if I give you a number and I say it is this temperature, I'm telling you that's how much heat is present. If I'm giving you a smaller number, it's got less heat, but not more of something else, more cold. See, so we have to compare the same thing on both sides of the spectrum. There's literally no such thing as cold, but we always talk in terms of how much heat energy is present on a thing. I think we may have actually just gone out on a screensaver for our recording. Are we still on? Okay. 10 minutes. Excellent. So, we've talked a little bit about heat energy. We've talked about how it works, and we're talking directly about how conduction happens. The more efficient a conductor is, the more effectively it can convey heat. This is what we saw in the experiment we did earlier. We saw that Andy's hand got much colder on the side with the conductor and got less cooled, or cooled less rapidly on the side that had an insulator. Now, let's talk about radiators. The radiator is probably the most easily recognized component in a cooling system. Now, over time, radiators have gone through several different changes in the way that they were constructed and in the materials they were built out of. But in all cases, the main function of a radiator is to diffuse the heat of the engine as efficiently as possible to prevent the engine from overheating. The engine requires an efficient cooling system. Roughly 60% of that heat that we were talking about earlier is diffused by the radiator in the cooling system. I'm going to skip the rest of my body objectives now. I'm going to step into the summary at the end of the lecture. Usually I would be continuing on with some of the other points at this point. In the summary, the main thing that I want to talk about is the importance of proper diffusion of heat in the cooling system. Radiators, as I said, are probably the most widely recognized cooling system component, and they also tend to be one of the most problematic system components. We do tend to have a lot of cooling system service that's directly related to the radiator. Remembering, of course, that, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, 40 cents of every dollar in the auto service industry is earned having to do with problems related to the cooling system. The key thing to remember here is that there are a number of common failures of the cooling system that can be tied directly back to radiator failure, whether that is blockage of the ports of the radiator, whether that's physical damage of the radiator, or whether that has to do with corrosion or breakdown of the actual materials that the radiator is made out of. Having an understanding of the science behind it, the flow of energy through it, and the way the materials of the radiator work together can help you to assure yourself that you're providing the best service possible for your customers. The other thing that understanding the science can do for you and can do for your shop is that it can help you to have a good conversation about your cooling system with a customer so that they don't end up failing to do the preventive maintenance that's required and find themselves having the more expensive problems down the road. Have a good